So today's daf is daf chaf. Let's review the last piece on Yud Testament Beis, so that we could have an easy takeoff. The Gemara had a suffix here, boy minei abayi mirabba, which was approximately 6-7 lines up from the bottom, and the suffix was whether or not, in the case that you bury Nebuchadnezzar relative during the regel, can you include and incorporate the 7 days of the regel into the shloshim? So you'd be -7 from the shloshim. And as far as Shiva is concerned, the Gemara points out that was never a suffix. You need all 7 days. The regel is not going to in any way detract from Shiva. In certain cases, the regel will be mavatal Shiva. In other cases, because the regel will have to, lift up the Shiva and place it after. But we never could include the days of the regel in the malos, in the counting of Shiva. But we can, perhaps, and the Gemara gives a logical reason why, we can calculate shloshim by using the days of the regel as part of the shloshim. And the reason for that is because, as we pointed out yesterday, there's an overlap between the laws of shloshim, navelus, and the laws of regel. In both cases, we have an Isur Kibus, and we have an Isur of haircutting, of giluach. So this question was raised, and Rabba's answer was, Eino Olech. We cannot integrate the days of the regel into the shloshim. And what we're up to now is Esvei. Abaye is going to quote a brisa in order to raise an objection against Rabba. So let's take a look at this Esvei. It should be 3 lines up before the end of Yud Testament. Now, this brisa has many parts to it, so we'll see if we can take it apart piece by piece. Hakover es meso shnei yomim odem l'regel. So the deceased was buried 2 days before Yom Tov, which means that the Avel observed Avel, his Avelus for 2 days. And that's not enough to be considered as if he had fulfilled the mitzvah of Shiva, because 2 days is a short amount of time. And therefore the Brisa says, Mona chamisha yomim liachar regel. You're going to have 2 days of Avelus, then regel, and then the balance of the 5 days. However, we're going to be makil, and we'll be lenient with regard to those 5 days after the regel, since they weren't continuous days of Avelus. It's only what we call a hashlama, and will allow work to be done by others on behalf of the other. The Ein Rabbim is asking him. The way Rashi interprets misaskim, it means menachem. The Rabbim will not be menachem the Avel during those 5 days of Avelus after the regel. Why not? So here we start our daf for today. They already were menachem Avelim during the regel. So it means that even though there's no Shiva, there is Nicham Avelim. And therefore the Nicham Avelim during the regel has already covered that mitzvah of Nicham Avelim. And in the 5 days after the regel, there's no need for Nicham Avelim. Yeah, I don't think we object to Nicham Avelim, but there's no requirement. Kol shel davar, kol shu mishum Avel, regel mafsiko. Kol shu mishum iskei rabim, ein regel mafsiko. So whatever nihugim apply to an avil, they are completely suspended during the regel. So, for example, an avil is chayiv in what's called natifas harash or kviyas hamita. All that is suspended during the regel. However, one dimension of avelus still continues even during the regel, and that's Nicham Avelim. So there'll be Nicham Avelim during the regel. Now here we have Machlokas Rishonim about what's called Dvarim Shebetzina. And according to those Rishonim who hold Dvarim Shebetzina in private, he is Noeg Avelus even during the regel. Then we begin to understand that not only was Nicham Avelim fulfilled during the regel, but even other dimensions, like for example, Mitzvah Tashma Shamita, which is in private, that would be a kiyum of Avelis during the regel. Now, we're not yet ready to analyze the Shita of Rabbah and raise an objection from this brisa. Keep in mind that Rabbah holds that the days of regel cannot be calculated into shlosh. So let's go on in the brisa until we complete the brisa, and then we'll see how Abaye, quoting this brisa, is going to disqualify the Shita of Rabbah. Kvaro Shlosha Yomim V'Sofa Regel. So this time the burial took place during the last 3 days of the regel. Moed Shiva Achar Regel. In such a case, that the burial took place within the last 3 days of the regel, in other words, towards the end of the yontif, then the entire shiva is lifted and placed after the regel. However, Arba Yomim Rishonim, if the burial took place during the first 4 days of the regel, then Rabbi Misaskim Bo, there was enough time during the balance of the regel to get 3 days of Nicham Avelim. Because again, we said before, established in the beginning of the brisa, that there's Nicham Avelim during the regel. In this case, there are 3 days of regel following the kvura, and therefore, b'shlosh yom achronim ein rab misaskim bo. 1 second. Arba yom rishonim. Right. So if it's Arba yom rishonim, so the burial took place within the first 4 days, then there'll be Nicham Avelim during the balance of the regel the other 3 days. But if the burial took place during the last 3 days, then Ein Rabbi Misaskim Bo, you will not get a full 3 days of Nicham Avelim. Shefar Kfarnis Asku Beregel. So once there was a kiyum of Nicham Avelim during the regel, then there's no need for Nicham Avelim after the regel. He clarifies it here. He says the last 3 days of the regel are reckoned together with the first 4 days of Shiva for a total of 7 days. Just 1 second. So let's just go over this one more time. If the burial took place within the last 3 days of the regel, then there was not enough of a kiyum of Shiva, meaning of Nicham Avelim in this case, during the regel, to consider it as if he had a kiyum of Shiva. So therefore, he's going to require a full 7 days after the regel, because the 3 days at the end of Yontif was not sufficient time for Nicham Avelim. Just 1 second. Oh, Yomi Rishon. I had this, but I lost it. 1 second. Arba Yomim Rishonim, Rabim is asking, Borrow Shloshim because it wasn't enough time to be nach.
Getting in 7 minutes.
Right. So since the kvura was during the last 3 days of the regel, and there was no kiyum of avelus before the regel, if there were a full 3 days from the kvura till the end of the regel, because the dead was buried during the first part of the regels, was a possibility of nichma velim. So now, shloshim. When he says Arba Yom Rishonim, Rabim is asking about, I'm assuming, I don't know why I don't see this explicitly. Right, but when was the burial in this case? Was the burial at the beginning of Yom Tov? It says Arba Yom Rishonim. But when was the Kfura? Because before we said at the beginning that the Kfura was 3 days before the end of the regel. Oh, this is a different case. So this case was a case where they had enough time to have 3 days of Nichma Velu. So again, let me assume that the dead was buried on day 3 of the regel. I'm just giving an example, right? Then there were 4 days left in the regel of Nicham Avelim, and those 4 days are days of Shiva. Why? Because there was a Kiyam Avelus through Nicham Avelim. Now, he has to be mashlim those 4 days to get up to 7 days, and therefore he needs 3 days of Avelus after the regel, but there won't be any Nicham Avelim shekvar nisasku beregel. In other words, he basically had 4 days of Shiva during the regel, and then 3 days after the regel. But just 1 second, the last 3 days of the regel, he says, are reckoned together with the first 4 days of Shiva. And I think he's saying here that the last 3 days of Shiva that he makes up after the regel do not require Nicham Avel because the entire Shiva is basically over.
Done by himself.
Okay. Now we get to Shlosh. The last part of the Bryce, and it says the regel ololo. And the 7 days of the regel are incorporated into the Shloshim period. My lava seifa. So at this point, Abai understands that the words "v'regel ololo" is referring to the seifa, which is the case of Shloshim, and therefore we see that regel is included in Shloshim against Rab. So the Gemara says Lo Areish, that the last part of this brisa of a regel ololo goes back to the Reisha of the brisa, where the kvura took place in the last part of the regel. So he began shiva of, let's say, 2 days during the regel. Now he's mashlim the other 5 days after the regel. And now the halacha is that since, just 1 second now, Rabbah says that regel is not ololo. Regel is not ololo because he started his shiva after the regel. In other words, you can't have shloshim before shiva. So if he had already enough days for shiva, so now he enters into shloshim. And in that case, even Rabbah would agree that regel ololo, because he already had a kiyum of shiva. So the kvura took place before the regel. Second. All right, let's go back to the ratio on Yutes Amid Beis. It says Hakovers Meso Shnei Yomim Kodem HaRegel. So he already started his shiva, and now he can use the regel to be Ol Shloshim. But in the Sefer, where he buried the dead on Yontif itself, whether it was within the first 4 days of Yontif or the last 3 days of Yontif, in that case, he has not fulfilled the mitzvah of Shiva, and therefore you cannot count the days as days of Shlosh Esvei. Now, Abai asks another kash on Rabba Regel, Ololo Leminian Shloshim Ketzai. When do we integrate the days of the Yontif into Shloshim? Kvaro B'tchilas HaRegel. So if he buried the dead at the beginning of the regel, and he had no chance to fulfill the Avelos of Shiva at all, Mona Shiva Liachar regel. So we lift up the Shiva and we place it after the regel. But now, since it's not Shiva directly after the Kvura, but a delayed Shiva as Ashlama, therefore others could do the work for him. The Ein Rabbim is asking Bosh Parnesasku Bo Beregel. So again, in this case, that he buried the dead at the beginning of the regel, there was plenty of time for Nicham Avelu during the Yontif. And now it says Beregel Ololo. And here's a case where he buried the dead on Yontif. And the regel is Ololo Minyan Shiva. I'm sorry, the regel is Ola Leminian Shloshim, as far as Shiva is concerned. So the Shiva will be observed after Yontif. But the regel itself is integrated into Shloshim. So we see against Rabbah, we see that Shloshim could be fulfilled, at least part of Shloshim, before Shiva. Tuvta. And the Gemara has no answer. He also Rabbi on Rabbi Yochanan Afilu Kvar Beregel. We can include the days of Yontif into Shloshim, even if the burial took place on Yontif. Orile, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Padas, Berei. Afilu Kvar Bereg. So the final maskana in this sugi is against Rabbah, and we see that all these Amoraim disagreed with Rabbah. They all hold that in a case where he buries his dead during the regel, the days of the regel are Ola L'Shloshim. And that's, as we said before, because there's an overlap of Nihuge, Avelus, and Shloshim, and the Kiyum of the regel. So he buried the dead 3 days before the regel. And he was Mekayim, the Niug Avelus of Kfiyas Hamita. Is Eino Tzarch L'Fosa Achar Regel. Divri Rabbi Eliezer. So what's the logic of Rabbi Eliezer? That he already had a kiyum avelus of 3 days before the regel. And that means that now regel is mevatel shiva. You don't need a kiyum haregel. I'm sorry, a kiyum avelus of 3 days, a minimum of 3 days. All you need is a mashu, the smallest amount of a kiyum of avelus. So he slept on a mita kfuya for 1 day or for 1 hour before Yontif. And then comes Yontif and it's mevatel shiva. That's the shita of the Chacham. Omer Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, hein divrei Beit Shammai, hein divrei Beit Hillel. The Gemara is going to say, based on the statement of Rabbi Elazar, that the machlokes that we had earlier is a machlokes between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai omrim shloshi yomim. Only if he observed Shiva for 3 days, that's enough to qualify as a Kiyum Shiva, so that now the regal comes after the 3rd day as Mevatel Shiva. Beit Hillel omrim afilu yom echad, which means afilu sha'achas. Omer Rav Huna Rav Chia bar Abba Rav Yochanan, v'amri le'omalu Rav Yochanan Rav Chia bar Abba, ula Rav Huna, afilu yom echad afilu sha'achas. We paskin lekula, like the Chachamim, that even if his kiyum avelus before regel was 1 day or 1 hour, that's enough for kiyum avelus, such that now regel comes along as mevatel shiva. Rava Amar, on the other hand, halacha ketana didan diyomer shlosha. We're going to pass on halacha like our Tana that we need 3 days of shiva, and then regel could be mavata, but not within that 3 days. Ravina ichlo l'sura d'pdas. Ravina shows up in a place called Sura. He says the process is the Euphrates River. Amalei Rav Chaviva l'Ravina. Hilchas Amai, Amalei afilu yom echad afilu sha'achas. Yosef Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka, Akila. Akila is a port to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. Nafak Milsami B'nai. And they're talking Divrei Torah. Minai Lavelu Shiva, what's the source for the minimum requirement of 7 days of Avelus? Tichsiv, in the Tochacha of Amos, it says, "V'afachti chagechem li'ev." I will convert your festivals to mourning. Ma'achag, we have a hekishah between Chag and Avelus. Ma'achag Shiva, af Avelus Shiva. So the Gemara is now, raising the objection here, playing the devil's advocate. It says Chag. What Chag are we referring to? Maybe it's referring to Shavuos, which is only a 1-day holiday. So the Gemara now is going to say that if you want to equate Avelus and Shavuos, then we have a different derivation from that analogy. Because Hahumi Boiler Kerush Lakish, Damei Shlakish from Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya, Minayin Lichmur Rechoka, Chainin Oheges El Yom Echad. We'll see later on, Shmur Rechoka means 30 days passed since the burial of the dead until he heard about it. He didn't know about it. He was in another part of the world. And in such a case, Reish Lakish says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya that the Kiyum Avelus is 1 day. And if this Chag is referring to the 1-day holiday of Atzeres, then the equation is to Avel. And under what circumstances is it enough to Kiyum Avelus of 1 day Ashkechan atzeres dikri chad yoma chag. Even one day is considered a chag, and that's the case in Shmur Rechok. Toner Rabbanan Shmur Krov and Oheges Shiva Shloshim. Shmur Rechok and Oheges El Yomech. Ezi Krov Ezi Rechok. Krova b'toch Shloshim. Rechok Lacher Shloshim. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. 30 days passed since the time of the death till he found out about it. Then Rabbi Akiva says that all he gets is 1 day of it. Chachamim never accepted this distinction and this halacha of reducing avelus in the case of Shmua Rechoka. No, even in Shmua Rechoka, he requires the full 7 days of avelus plus shlosh. Now, normally, when you have machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, we have a principle based on a pasuk we read just a few days ago, Achri Rabim Lahatos, that we go basaro. And we pass like the Rab, which would be a chumrah. But Omar Rab of Bar Marchanim Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Mokum Shatamot Diyokin make a Rab Machmirim, we're always going to pass like the Rabbin Lahachmir. Halachic Rab Chutz Mizu, with the exception of Avelus. Why? Shafal Pisha Rabbi Akiva make it. B'chachal Machmir Halachic Rabbi Akiva. T'yomer Shmuel Halachic Yidivei Mekel B'Avel. And Halachic Yidivei Mekel B'Avel, we accept the person who has the lenient position in Avelus, even though he's a Yachid. And in this case, we're going to accept Rabbi Akiva's opinion that a Shmua Rechoka generates a Chiv Avelis of 1 day, and only 1 day. So again, normally, if the Yachid is Mekil against the Rabbin, then we have to pass like the Rabbin. But in Avelus, Halacha Kedivrei HaMekil B'Av. Rav Chanina Asyolei Shmua di'avua mibei chozoi. So Reb Chanina found out about his father's passing, di'avua, and there was a delay until he finally found out. Asal kami de Rav Chizda, amalei Shmua rechoka einu noheges el yom echad. So Rav Chizda paskin like Rabbi Akiva, the brisa that we saw before, that Shmua Rechoka generates a chiv avelis of 1 day. Rav Nasan bar Ami also leilu Shmua di'imei mibei chozoi also kami de Rava amalei harei amru Shmua Rechoka einu noheges el yom echad bilvad. Eisvei. The Brisa says, "Bamed dvar mamburim." When do we say that there's only 1 day of Avelis for Shmur Rechoka? That's the Chamisha Meisei Mitzvah. Imo Shiva Ushloshim. We're more machmer on the Avelis of Imo than the other 5 relatives. So B'Chamisha, there we're going to be making, and we can fall back on the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. And in Shmur Rechoka, all you need is 1 day of Avelis. But with regard to the Imo, you get the full Shiva of Avelis and the full Shloshim of Avelis, even in a case of a Shmur Rechoka. So now we understand Rav Nasan bar Ami is arguing that in this case, it was my mother who died, then I should be observing the full Shiva and the full Shloshim. Amalei Yechidai, v'lo Sfirlon Kavaseh. Now, we're going to pass like Rabbi Akiva. Just 1 second. We're going to pass like Rabbi Akiva that the halacha of Havelus Yom Echad for a Shvua Rechok applies to all relatives without distinction, and even to Av V'Ima. And that opinion that you saw in the Brisa that was quoted earlier by Reb Nosson, namely that Av V'Ima requires a full Shiva, full Shloshim, that's a Yechidah, that's an individual time. The Sanya, Maisa Umeis Aviv Shel Rebbe Tzadok, Beginzak. So Rebbe Tzadok lost his father, Bodiu Liachar Shalosh Shanim. He found out 3 years later. Uba v'sholes Alisha ben Avuya Uzkenim She'ima. Do I require Avelis? Do I not? So 3 years went by until he found out about the death of his father. The Amru, and these Chachamim, including Elisha ben Avuya, answered the question L'chumra by saying Shivo Shloshim. So we see that there is such an opinion that even in a Shvua Rechok, you require the full blast of Avelis. Shemeis beno shel Rabbi Achia had Bagola. Yoshav Olav Shivo Shloshim. He only found out about it after 30 days. And despite that fact, he sat Shiva and Shlosh and observed Shlosh. Rabbi Achia is now following the view of the Chachamim against Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara asks, Eini is this so? V'ha Rav Achua the Rabbi Chia. So Rav is the nephew of Rabbi Chia. The Hu Barachate the Rabbi Chia. He's the son of Rabbi Chia's brother, and also the son of Rabbi Chia's sister. He's Solik Lahasam. Rav made the trek from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Amar Le Abba Kayam. This is a case where somebody asks you a question, you don't want to give them a direct answer. So you ask him another question to sort of divert him. So again, Rav is coming to Eretz Yisrael, and Reb Chia is in Eretz Yisrael. Now Reb Chia is going to ask Rav about both his father and his mother, because Reb Chia in Eretz Yisrael didn't know whether his brother and his sister were still alive. And here we turn to Chaf Hamid Beis.